afternoon, I'm Matthew Mild. Thank you for joining us at the Institute of Modern Languages Research, School of Advanced Study, University of London today. Welcome to the seminar, Posthuman Transcultural Memory in Fiction and Visual Culture, which is hosted by the Centre for the Study of Cultural Memory. Many thanks go to the Director of the Institute of Modern Languages Research, Catherine Davis, the Institute Manager, Kathy Collins, and the Director of the Centre for the Study of Cultural Memory, who's here with us today, Kato Guzzi. This seminar explores the theme of progressive and anti-essentialist or posthuman endeavours and cultural memory across different cultures. The methods and latest findings related to cognitive and cultural memory studies can be used to broaden the scope of the seminar by introducing migrant literature from France, the United Kingdom, Italy and Germany, in a way which is particularly relevant to the pioneering work on transcultural memory, which is a concept that was first explored precisely here in the Centre for the Study of Cultural Memory by this research centre's director, Kato Guzzi, and other scholars in 2010. Trauma and nostalgia will be examined both as philosophical and as political categories of neurological and cultural remembrance in the aftermath of the EU refugee and security crisis. Perhaps post-traumatic stress is an area of study whose liminality between neurological and cultural memory can play a part in fostering an aesthetic estrangement from othering ideologies. A critical re-engagement with a piece of the European self in its non-Christian neighbours, everyday radical thinking, and the social reinvestment in interfaith understanding give rise to multiple lieux de mémoire, to borrow the sociologist Pierre Nora's extremely helpful concept beyond established definitions of identity and belonging. And this event is part of my recent scholarly work as a fellow in cultural memory studies at the Institute of Modern Language Research, School of Advanced Study, University of London. I previously lectured in Italian and European history in Northwest England and Wales, and I've published in the field of contemporary history of fiction and performing arts from France, the United Kingdom, Italy and Germany. My current research deals with migrant cultural memory in cinema and literature. About a year ago, I had to switch off the radio for a few days to reduce my daily intake of comments on the, to everyone's relief, overruled Muslim travel ban across the pond. Meanwhile, on our side of the ocean, a young Turkish-French film director called Deniz Gamze Erdogan has been widely acclaimed for her debut, which is a brilliant addition to the impressively long list of highly successful migrant European films made by film directors originally from the same Muslim-majority country, from Turkey. I'll leave to David, Professor Lomas, the exciting task to delve into visual material very shortly, and I'll rather align myself with Hannah's exploration of memory in narration. To open our seminar, I'll give an overview on interfaith memory in film and fiction. We'll look at works by the Lebanese-French novelist Amin Maalouf, the British novelist Harry Kunzru, the Turkish-Italian film director Ferzen Öztürk, and the Turkish-German film director Ftihaki. The title of my talk. The title of my talk is Everyday Post-Faith Reintegrating #memory, Film Fictional Pragmatographies of Disoriented Ration. Amin Maalouf tells the story of a group of originally Lebanese friends who plan to have a reunion after several decades living in their respective new countries. However, the disorientation highlighted in the novel's title is more than a pun on their dispersion from the mythic Orient, containing the Middle Eastern layer of their multiple identities. The title of the novel is The Désorienté, the disorientated or the lost ones. Their disorientation is also used as a metaphor for the off-balancing experienced on a collective level by Arabs and other migrants from Muslim-majority countries, including Amin Maalouf's Lebanon. Quote, ce qui est certain, c'est que cette succession de débâcles a progressivement déséquilibré le monde arabe, puis l'ensemble du monde musulman, déséquilibré au sens politique et aussi au sens clinique. On ne sort pas indemne d'une série d'humiliations publiques. Tous les Arabes portent les traces d'un traumatisme. profond. Je ne m'exclus pas du lot, mais ce traumatisme arabe, lorsqu'on le contemple de l'autre rive, la rive européenne, ma rive adoptive, ne suscite que l'incompréhension et la suspicion. My translation, clearly, the string of failures has gradually made the Arab world feel off balance, and the whole Islamic world too, that is, off balance, not only on the political plane, but also medically. Political humiliations leave scars. All Arabs bear traces of a deep trauma, including myself, on the other side of the sea, in my adoptive land of Europe. This Arab trauma triggers just a far-reaching lack of trust and understanding, and of course, end of translation. Similarly, disorientation and a clinical or medical concern with trauma and nostalgia can be found in Harry Kunzer's novel Gott Without Pen, Ferzan Öztürk's film Saturn in Opposition, and Ftiakin's film The Edge of Heaven. The neurological condition of coma in Malouf and Öztürk, autism in Kunzer, and post-traumatic stress in Aachen are deployed as forms of literary engagement with neurological and cultural trauma and nostalgia in their three respective Muslim-majority non-Christian countries, Lebanon, Turkey, and India. So the lens of migration to France, the United Kingdom, and the United States in Kunzer's novel, Italy and Germany. All these works share a renegotiation of manhood mediated by the experience of sexual assault experienced by women, exploitation and harassment, which is endured both by non-Western culture and by Western culture women. These are some recurring patterns in their narratives: estrangement and a metafiction engagement with both trauma and nostalgia, whereby the author himself reminds the audience that all narratives are constructions and all subjectivities or identities are highly performative, and a non-linear kind of irony that reminds us that memory involves a continual, ceaseless process of remediation, which isn't linear, but cyclical. Besides facing unprecedented fraud and hacking allegations, and despite winning the election based on the voting system in place, even President Trump lost the popular vote. As such radicalized anti-migration populists as Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, and the self-avowed government jaundiced hedge fund investor Robert Mercer have been exposed as divisive and sneakily undemocratic forces in the aftermath of Trump's exposed sexism and history of tax evasion and the Brexit surge in xenophobic crime, including the murder of Eric Josbig here in the UK and the Liverpool kebab shop attack, let alone following the historic defeat of populist Islamophobia in France and in the Netherlands. A new posthuman and anti-essentialist dialogue between Islam and other faiths, cultures, or lifestyles has commenced. Masculinity, too, has been opened up to renegotiation by the #MeToo hashtag movement for women's rights to protection against sexual assault and harassment. Parallel to this, global warming and climate change have found become undisputed scientific facts, and the misleading models selected for the privilege of tax-evading businesses, law-making rigged by bribery, and white male, straight, able Christian dominance that rule the empire of all have been increasingly exposed to scrutiny. The empire of oil has come under attack from the voices of the subaltern, others who have been excluded. Subaltern cultural memory rests on self-awareness, both on the individual level of fictional characters and readers whose interests are represented by the four authors, often with Orientalist styles, or styles that criticize Orientalism, but also on the social and political plane of gender and ethnic emancipation from such essentialist hierarchies as the ones incarnated in Orientalist patterns. Judith Halberstam and Ira Stevenson note that the self-awareness of someness, belonging to some, and otherness is key to posthuman understandings of gender and power. The human has been configured, quote, as a tribal circle gathered round the fire amid the looming darkness of a dangerous world. It is only partially our membership in the club that enables us to contest the rules and beg to differ. The darkness looms within the circle in a virulent form. Some of the some that we are have been excluded through multiple articulations among the constitutive roles of others, because otherness is not additive in the traditional sense, is not best representative of the post-human. Post-humans have been multiply colonized, interpenetrated, constructed, as well as paradoxically empowered, but neither virtue nor vice attaches automatically to this position of post-humanism. End of quote. Danger, and therefore fear, constitute a primordial drive to the establishment of cultural memory, wherein safety and security are the chief concern. The otherness of subaltern positions, however, supplies the social and individual drive to radical cultural change, whose ultimate goal and purpose is gradually correcting exclusion and fostering inclusive redefinitions of gender, ethnic, and other types of membership or belonging to someness, which is both collective and cognitive or neurological if you consider cultural memory. Marco Rox notes that a new neurological interest has emerged in recent fiction, which he traces back all the way to Will Smith's Dalloway, Melville's Moby Dick, and Faulkner's The Sun and the Fury. Marco Rox's overview on recent neuronovels is accurate, however there's some distinctions to be made. For instance, he argues that there are some harder and some softer neuronovels based on how they position the neurological conditions they discuss, which is a bit too clear-cut, more clear-cut than it is in the practice of the works of the writers we examine today. Such neuroscientists as Eric Kandel, Vilayana Ramachandran, and Norman Deutsch have found evidence of the key function played by the so-called neuroplastic rewiring of memory and learning for the brain's activity. For instance, in the treatment of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, learned fears stored in the brain's cingulate gyrus and reflected in the orbitofrontal cortex are unlearned by activating the gear shift, which is supplied in the brain's cortical nucleus. In these and other cases, new neural networks replace old ones, thanks to the neuroplastic property of neurons and synapses processing information. Particularly in relation to postcolonial memory, Gayatri Spivak shows how the representation of the object can be challenged through a counter-gaze, which is directed at the subject as if he were looking in textual mirrors, which she calls subaltern reversal. Gayatri Spivak argues, quote, between patriarchy and imperialism, subject constitution and object formation, the figure of a woman disappears, not into a pristine nothingness, but into a violent shuttling, which is the displaced figuration of a third world woman, caught between tradition and modernization, end of quote. The subject-object relations sanctioned in gender and ethnic discourses in film or fictional works are worth investigating here. So, Malouf's latest French-language migrant novel, Les Désorientés, The Disorientated, is about a group of old friends who are disorientated on various individual and collective planes. The novel's tragic ending is exalted by the ancestral meanings associated with the protagonist's name, Adam, as he ends up in a coma as a result of a car crash. My translation of the quote: this is an alternative afterword, him ending in a coma, that Adam never had the chance to write. Perhaps he was writing it in his head when he had his car crash. The answer will have to wait until the day he wakes up, if he ever will. The doctors are clueless. They do say that he will long stay somewhere between life and death before settling on either side. Dolores, his wife, has moved in by plane to a clinic in Paris. Always at his bed, she says, he's in a limbo, like his country and like the planet, she adds, in a limbo, like us all. End of my translation. It follows logically that Adam embodies the prototypal model of raiser of questions, the beg for an answer. In the novel, the posthuman existential renewal of transcultural and neurological memory hinges on the uncanny liminal position of an anti-essentialist subject who challenges norms and everyday misreadings in a non-linear and cyclical way. Martin Heidegger notes, quote, followed by my translation, der Rufer ist das Dasein in seiner Unheimlichkeit, das ursprüngliche, geworfene in der Weltsein als Unzuhause, das nackte Das im Nichts der Welt. Der Rufer ist dem alltäglichen Mann selbst unvertraut. So etwas wie eine fremde Stimme. Was könnte dem Mann verloren in die besorgte, vielfältige Welt fremder sein, als es in der Unheimlichkeit auf sich vereinzelte, in das Geworfene selbst? My translation, the raiser of concerns and questions is existential being on an uncanny plane. The prototypal being projected in the world as unfamiliarity, the bare linking or conjunction of utterances in the nothingness of the world. The raiser of concerns is unfamiliar even to the everyday state of habitual routine and normalcy, which Heidegger calls man, what you do, what people do, much like a foreign voice. What could be stranger to normativity, which is lost in a concerned and many-layered universe, than the subject that has been projected into nothingness and self-individualized in an uncanny space, and of course in my translation, which we could call a posthuman or anti-essentialist subject. Similarly, Öztürk's Saturn in opposition, Kunzer's Gods Without Men, and Akin's The Edge of Heaven intentionally raise more questions than they answer, precisely by stressing the liminality of neurological and cultural identities, formed at the present historical interstices of multiple traumas, endured, among others, in other Muslim-majority countries besides Mimulus Lebanon, including India and Turkey. In Kunzer's novel Gods Without Men, the Indian-American Jazz and the Jewish-American Lissa struggle to meet their autistic son's needs. His name is Raj, and the main characters of the parallel subplots, whose storylines are interlocked with Raj's kidnapping and his disenchanted father's exposure as an inadequate parental figure, provide a fitting counterpoint to Jazz's masculinity of fatherly disenchantment. An extraterrestrial cult leader in the desert, which is a parallel subplot, is emblematic of a wider understanding of masculinity in crisis. Quote, he quit before they could fire him, withdrew his savings from the bank, packed his library and his papers into his 38 Ford pickup, and headed for the desert. In his mind, he saw himself as one of the prophets of old, an ascetic sitting cross-legged in a cave. He would mortify his body, purify his mind. The world is split into either side of the Iron Curtain. He would heal the wound. His intention was to summon the only force powerful enough to transcend communism and capitalism and halt the cascade of destructive energies. Since the dawn of history, there had been contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, Ezekiel's wheels within wheels, the Mayan space pilots, the cosmic weaponry of Vedic India. The visitors possessed a spiritual technology. It was time for them to manifest themselves, to intervene in the lives of men, end of quote. So the prophet embodies an arguably inevitably unsuccessful escapist outcome of the corrosive masculinity associated with consumerist privilege in late capitalist settings. His avoidance of everyday solutions and his tragicomic escape from society is coloured by these allusions to interfaith, cross-cultural mystical systems ranging from Western monotheism and non-Western polytheism, to imaginative New Age horizons of cosmic travels and communication. The prophet's narrative suggested Jazz's fatherly disenchantment and ultimately his inability to make any sound neuroplastic progress to reconcile his consumerist masculinity in his relationship to his autistic child mirrors the soulless, materialist corrosion of familial and social ties that underpins consumerist, white Western masculine privilege and hegemony. In addition to the prophet's escapism, the novel deploys the pop rock musician, Nicky, a man, as an epitome of shallow hegemonic masculinity, caricatured through a lively satire of youth culture stardom, including some subtle hints at the sexual exploitation of women. Quote, Nicky had a rule, never get sentimental about birds. After all, half the world's gash at the end of the day. But Anouk, his girlfriend, was different. She didn't fall for his act. In a funny, bored way, she saw right through him. He hated putting the phone down on her, but she had to play the game, never let him get the upper hand. After the Fashion Week conversation, he did what he always seemed to do nowadays when he had a problem, worked through the minibar. First vodkas, then gins, whiskies, then whatever was left. He watched bad telly and looked at YouTube. He could feel himself spiraling into the dark place. Her voice had sounded so flat. Who was she with over there in Paris? Most of the blogs in fashion were queer, which if you were going after the model was a mercy, but there was always model enough stray ones sniffing about, photographers for a start, lecherous bastards all, and those 50-year-old rich geezers you only seem to see at fashion parties, the ones with orange hands and a thing for teenagers, sick industry, when you came to think about it. End of quote. The place of women, intoxication, including through alcohol, media, non-straight men, and rich older men in Nicky's views sums up his shallow form of selfhood. Women, particularly girlfriends, function as rivals in the game of power and control. Intoxication replaces the prophet's aliens in the pop rock musician's own system to escape from challenges instead of managing them. The role of media is auxiliary to his objective. Non-straight men are depicted as helpless and harmless parts for whom there is no place in the game of control and authority that only straight men are entitled to play. And rich older men's predatory sexism is a symptom of the industry's sickness, only insofar as they compete with equally sexist, though less well-off, younger men, such as Nicky himself. The novel crowns this triangular dismantling of masculinity by portraying the non-linear temporal plane of a Spanish Jesuit on a mission among Native Americans from a distant historical past, and here you find sexual violence as such. Quote, it is to his credit that in the 10 years Frege says has lived in this remote outpost, the mission has made such progress in agriculture. It now produces a sufficiency of corn, wheat, barley and beans, and in good years is able to generate a small income by selling food to the Presidio. Fray Garces has also set his neophytes to work in producing candles, tallow, soap and other necessities. There are 3 looms on which San Javier produces a small quantity of sackcloth. This suffices to cover the shameful nakedness of the neophytes. Fray Garces is in possession of several bolts of red-dyed linen imported from Castile. This cloth is much prized by the savages, and the Fry uses it to reward and encourage his charges. Fray Garces is under his care 400 Indians, including a small number of mestizos and coyotes, most of whom are the descendants of soldiers, stationed here during the Jesuit times. For his own part, he maintains an absolute prohibition on the fraternization of Españoles and Indians. This is hard for him to enforce. The mission is guarded by a corps of 11 soldiers under the command of the captain of the earth. This young captain and most of his men are without wives, however they appear to be good Christians on the whole. End quote. Capitalism and the media, incarnated by the prophet and the musician, are complemented by Christian colonialism and imperialism, whose embodiment is the missionary Garces. The missionary exploits cheap labor. The workers' shameful nakedness, quote-unquote, underscores the Eurocentric racism they're subjected to by the missionary. These, quote-unquote, savages include some mixed-race individuals whose army origin into sexual violence, completing the prophet's escape from capitalism and the musician's addiction to the media and other intoxicants. The missionary's imperialism represents the root of the disenchanted father's masculinity under the novel's semiotic microscope. So just as paternal disenchantment, the protagonist's fatherly disenchantment has a central part in the narration, quote, a terrible thing for a father to think about his son, who is autistic, but it was true. Despite the craziness at the firm, the foul-mouthed traders, the pressure from Fenton to sign off on Bachman's latest apocalyptic scheme, work was an oasis of tranquility, compared to what the child had waited for him at home. The sinking feeling as he turned the key and called out hello, and tried to judge from Lisa's face and posture just how bad it had been for her that day. When he was born, Raj wouldn't feed, he hated to be picked up, then when he started teething, he granted Lisa's nipples like an animal. He transformed her, she became a whipping, hollow-eyed version of herself, a wan creature in thick socks and sweatpants, a lovely long blonde hair plastered to a scalp. This is not my son. Jazz caught himself thinking, my son wouldn't do this to my beautiful wife. End of quote. Kunzra here estranges the reader by juxtaposing Raj's Indian-Jewish racial hybridity, bodily otherness from adulthood, and disabled position of autism, with Jazz's fatherly disenchantment and alienation. His mother Lisa's role as the female object only underscores Raj's monstrous abjection and exclusion. This macroscopic sketch of Jazz's everyday anxieties condenses inadequacy and latent emotional disintegration. Only few rare epiphanies of fatherly involvement and interaction are scattered throughout Kunzra's pitiless representation of the crisis occurring in Jazz's post-colonial masculinity. Quote, the wider world moved on from the stranger to story. There was a presidential election to think about. Their neighbours were imagining change they could believe in, canvassing and putting up posters. Their lives required a thin membrane of normality, like a scarf. Then another jolt of weirdness. Tory back open. Jazz had been watching the financial crisis as if through the wrong end of a telescope. Events that a few months previously would have dominated his life, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the plummeting Dow, seemed to be taking place in an alternate reality unconnected to his. He didn't go online to check his own portfolio, though he knew it must be taking a huge hit. They all go to hell, he thought, all those giant abstractions, the gambles of thin air. Here were the fallen leaves, the smell of his son's skin. End quote. The novel's juxtaposition of anti-imperialist, non-linear temporality, caricatural escapism, and satirical youth stardom with the disenchanted father's unscaled heights of fatherly engagement covers the multiple emergencies of financial disaster, climate change, and ambivalent hybridity. Gods Without Men mercilessly dismantles cosmopolitan masculinities with varying degrees of consumerist privilege and alienation. Only a thin line separates Jazz's subaltern proficiency from his hegemonic hardwiring that makes any neuroplastic progression perfectly unachievable. The everyday macro-resistance of ubiquitous yet vulnerable familial and social transactions provides the urgent yet distant solution to viral spending and gambles. The wealthy outsiders in the film sat in opposition by Fersen Öztürk are the same-sex couple formed by Loretta Dagd and Diabetas Lorenzo in Rome, where same-sex couples have no legal rights yet, while Davide's best friend, portrayed here, the Turkish interpreter Naval, is a childless married woman, and their mutual friend, the banker Antonio, is married to his children's mother, Angelica, though he cannot help cheating on her. And what features in this film is a disarming, ironic gaze, which is staged in frequent frames with mirror reflections and makeup in several scenes, which underscores a ceaseless self-making and remaking through sharing with others, and sometimes splitting oneself into multiple images and splinters by endlessly making up and telling ever new stories, far beyond any absolutely valid, moral or modern set of natural laws. Here are characters wear multiple selves as masks, and their shape is relative to the others in each different situation. With a stunting colour tribute to Pedro Almodovar's Spain, Antonio's werewolf-like metamorphosis down a crowded street leading to his lover, Laura, follows a neuroticism that escapes and subverts middle-class family norms. A mature father is here unmasked and masked again as a docile victim of his lover's seductive powers. Which happens also in Özpetek's later film, Mine Vaganti, Loose Cannons. What looked like a perfect model of parenthood here ends up in a fiasco as Angelica and Antonio get caught up in their own fights and forget to appease those between the neglected children. And in a telling parallel, what looked like a happy, although unusual family comes to an end when Lorenzo's partner and friends eventually have no rights over his body in hospital after the incident that leads him to coma. after taking drugs. This ironic gaze hints at how other kinds of bonds earn the same rights as legally recognized families. The film came out before the first Italian laws recognizing same-sex families. And one scene stages this view of identity and gender as a set of elusive speech genres which are relative to relationships defined through discursive utterances in given situations, when the protagonist, the writer Davide, harshly tells Antonio, who's been cheating on his wife, that he's unable to create his family story in his own identity, following the fairy tale performance genre, which belongs to the traditional gender discourses of marriage and parenthood that he himself has chosen together with his wife. Here, the room's dim light and dark colours are semiotic signs underscoring the scene's richness in meaning. This short monologue reminds the audience that the film is experimenting precisely on unusual blends of male and female gender performances and sentimental and minority film genres. The outcome of these blends is precisely fairy tale, whose unfolding ungrounds and lets down all expectations for a happy ending, featuring the triumph of the prince and the princess. As with the novels by Mimiluf, this film's fictional text reflects on fiction itself as the only source left when spring manifold fluid versions of identity. As suggested by breathtaking circular framing, the closing scene, nothing lasts forever, no understandings of the human subject or family. Everything appears to be transient. In the closing scene, this is compared to the metaphor of the wind blowing on the tennis table, and the final song also has lyrics about transience. But particularly the character of Naval, the Turkish interpreter, reminds the audience of the cultural closeness of Italy and Turkey, even from the very first sequences, where Oriental sounds, tastes, and colors highlight how these different cultures are close. Then Naval herself is Turkish, comes up only in a blatant way very, very late in the film. When Lorenzo's stepmother comes to the hospital, and on hearing her name, Naval asks, "Are you a foreigner?" and hears back a hilarious reply, "No, I'm Turkish." This quick script line sum up a fitting political understanding of slowly transforming social roles and positionings. Recent European cinema often deals precisely with migratory flows from the south and the east. There's also a scene in the film where the group of friends immediately sympathize and empathize with someone at the hospital, although they can't understand what she's saying because she's talking on the phone in a language from the former communist bloc without any subtitles, but still they immediately empathize with her. Statements such as those about Turkish and Balkan migrants sharing much with their Mediterranean and European host countries, or foreigners always already belonging elsewhere with the status of ethnic insiders in their home country, are points clearly made in this film with significant political implications. Whereas in the German film The Edge of Heaven, of der anderen Seite, the son of a Turkish migrant to Germany, Nejat, inhabits a liminal space marked by economic and cultural globalization. And this is his father meeting a Kurdish prostitute in Hamburg. The opening flash forward shows his son, Nejat, stopping at a gas station in Turkey, which supplies a subtle hint of ubiquitous oil in a globalized modern world driven by science and technology. As a lecturer in German literature at the University of Hamburg, Nejat resists global trends through his intellectual moderation. Paradoxically, his father, portrayed here, is an easier prey to global materialism, which is here loosely blended with traditional family demands. The middle-aged man makes a financial deal with a prostitute of Turkish origin and of Kurdish background in the picture, the screenshot. At last, he kills her during a violent outburst. Now, the subplot of the son who overcomes the father through his violence provides the narrative frame for the story of the prostitute's daughter, The prostitute has a daughter back in Turkey. Her name is Ayten, but she's also known as Gul. Her mother tells her she sells shoes while she secretly works as a prostitute to pay her college fees back in Turkey. The tragic death of this character within the setting of cross-border modern materialism and commodification sketches the drama of fatal global trends whose victims occupy marginal transnational spaces. After her mother's murder in Germany, Gul, or Ayten, she's called both names, seeks refuge in this European country in order to escape from the Turkish government who wishes to jail her as a Kurdish activist. More transnational levels than one intersect here as Gul fights for transnational human rights denied in Turkey and eventually finds shelter as a transnational subject in Germany, although only temporarily, right where her mother works and dies. The character of the brave daughter embodies the fight against state terrorism in a westernized Muslim country. Her final imprisonment back in Turkey hints at the failure of EU countries, which thus become tacit accomplices of overseas authoritarian governments demanding back any asylum seekers. Her love story with Lotte in Germany, another girl, takes on a tragic shape when Lotte follows her to Turkey and is murdered while trying to help other Kurdish activists. As with her mother's murder in Germany, the failure of social and political organizations makes victims who inhabit marginal and liminal positions of dissidence and resistance. So on all sides of this cross-border drama, marginal transnational subjects call for social change and renewal. Small wonder Gul is sceptical about European integration in a wider socio-political context of marginalization and othering. Now, to conclude this overview, countercultural fiction, experimental films, and audiovisual performance deploy the public's interest in the world of impressions and the author's penchant for the quotidian in intricate neural narratives of unmanning and remanning, particularly with regards to post-colonial masculinity. Neuroplastic rewiring is achieved in the four works we've looked at through storytelling, transformation, and self-awareness. These works portray multiple masculinities as one fragmented whole. The sense of complete and functional neurocultural selfhood, which is lost as a result of abjection and social maladaptation, is restored only by the neuroplastic power of narration, education, and understanding throughout the four works. Like our seminar here today, these literary and audiovisual works endeavour to question existing demarcations between genres, media, and cultures. I'm grateful to all of you for becoming our fellow questioners here at our seminar in the second year of the looming Mexican War, and take this chance to challenge intangible walls together, also the two next speakers, an awareness of fiction's own reflective and neuroplastic potential in these posthuman works conjures the shaping of multiple subaltern permutations of the self. Thank you. And our next speaker today is joined us from the University of York. And her research cuts across politics and English literature, British literature. This is Dr. Hannah Kershaw. Thank you for joining us. Today she'll give us a talk about British Muslim fiction.
Thanks.
And I was keen to hear more on this subject because clearly this seminar today about posthuman transcultural memory follows up on a larger conference that was held in Utrecht, Netherlands, last summer, where we had a number of contributions on several transcultural cases, but we didn't have anything specific about Muslims in a particular European or Western country. So I'm very keen to hear what you'll tell us today, Hannah. We got your two slides sorted.
I don't need to bring it up quite now.
That's great.
So I've got it ready. So.
Good.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew. I just thought I'd briefly introduce myself, I suppose, in a bit more detail, and also say what it is I'm doing, really. So I technically graduated from my PhD a couple of weeks ago, actually, after months and months of paperwork and waiting, things like that. But eventually it was all done, which was nice. And my PhD, when I started, I knew that I wanted to focus on Muslims in Britain and also politics of multiculturalism. My background is English literature, but I actually managed to get funding through a politics department, which was quite lucky because I managed to bring a new discipline into my work, which is really good. But throughout the PhD, I actually realised I was becoming increasingly interested in memory. And this is kind of what has come out of it. And this is, I suppose, quite a small portion of a much larger chapter and, of course, a much larger thesis. And the hope from this is, first of all, to hopefully turn this into a book at some point, or if not, then a collection of publications. And in the future, to think more about if I could carry on with working in memory studies, particularly looking more towards this concept of transcultural memory, and also maybe looking at the idea of Marion Hirsch's post-memory, which is something that also started to come up in my research. So first of all, I'm just going to talk a bit about my understanding of cultural memory and how I'm using it in regards to post-colonialism. And then I'm going to go into some more depth and some literary analysis about two of the novels that I talk about in my PhD. So the concept of cultural memory implies an ongoing history that is located in a specific culture and passed down generationally. Sudhir Karkar defines it as the imaginative basis for a sense of cultural identity, a group's history freed from rootedness in time. Cultural memory is, to quote, handed down, learned, taught, researched, interpreted and practiced, being both sustained and perpetuated by those who the memories belong to. This suggests that cultural memory is something that, whilst being sustained and continued, must be reinterpreted and reimagined, depending on the conditions in which the memory is being passed down. Cultural memory is also something that functions as a powerful binding force for communities and societies. Paul Connaughton acknowledges this back and forth relationship between the present and the past, arguing that our knowledge of the past has a great impact on how we experience the present, which may seem like maybe a slightly obvious statement, but I think the extent to which the past has an influence on the present is something that is always worth exploring and brings up a lot of new interpretations, particularly of fiction. So cultural memory is not something that is passively passed down a generational ladder, but is something that consciously marks the borders and boundaries of a community, showing who belongs and who does not. Significantly more scholarly work from my research that I found has been produced on the role of memory in the lasting trauma of the Holocaust, rather than on memories of colonialism. As Michael Rothberg explains, this phenomenon does not necessarily mean that we must approach memory as competitive. Rather, it can be multi-directional, subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing and borrowing. Employing the concept of cultural memory, I found when writing the thesis, is beneficial in helping us to understand how literature explores the Muslim migrant experience. So writers of post-colonial fiction often use literary techniques that engage with history and cultural memory because they allow authors to participate in an act of subversive resistance. In his monograph entitled The Post-Colonial Historical Novel, Hamish Daly argues that post-colonial literature can be valued as, to quote, a resource for learning about histories that lie outside the Eurocentric mainstream, and that post-colonial novels are not only imaginative endeavours, but also can produce meaningful knowledge of contested pasts. So, although I agree with Daly's argument here, that post-colonial historical fiction can offer a reader new knowledge about colonial pasts, his suggestion that text can be used as a resource for learning about histories runs the risk of consigning and reducing post-colonial literature to mere reflections of historical reality. Just as historical documents written by colonial powers are filtered through layers of human subjectivity, so are the post-colonial novels that speak back to forms of Eurocentric historical narratives. My approach to post-colonial historical fiction is perhaps more cautious, aligned with Jerome de Groot's description of such texts as, to quote, troubling mainstream accounts of the past, challenging orthodoxy, offering space to silenced voices, engaging in political rewriting and responding to the legacies of empire. If we adhere to an understanding of the historical narrative as always to some extent subjective, offering interpretations rather than truths, then post-colonial fiction can also be seen as offering new interpretations, but not necessarily objective truths. Bill Ashcroft explains that the question of resistance in post-colonial history becomes explicable as a contest of narratios, encapsulated in narrative statements, but may offer an incompatible and contesting narratio to official histories. So basically what this means is, so the concept of narratios was coined by a man called F.R. Ankersmith in his text called Narrative Logic, and he claimed that historical discourse exists only because of other historical discourses, not because of the past itself, which of course no longer exists. So to explain this, he uses the analogy of clocks. So the time on a clock can only be compared to other times on clocks, not to time itself. In other words, accounts of historical events from a post-colonial perspective offer alternative ways to understanding the past and add to or challenge already written histories. But our inability to return to the past itself means that each narratio challenges another, but none can claim genuine truth. The novels that I discuss, using Ashcroft's terminology, engage in a process of interjection. Ashcroft explains that this forms the basic premise of historical narratives. The basic premise of historical narratives in this form are accepted, but a contrary narrative, which claims to offer a more immediate or truer picture of post-colonial life, is inserted into the historical record. So in other words, a novel that adopts interjection introduces an alternative minority perspective on historical events and weaves this into the discussion or representation of what happened in order to demonstrate the presence of alternative historical truths. The act of writing back, in contrast, is described by Ashcroft as interpolation, or rethinking history through canonical counter-discourse. So famous texts that do this, for example, well, ones that have been sort of written back to as such would be Othello, The Tempest, Robinson Crusoe, Mansfield Park, and Jane Eyre. So they have all been written back to for more contemporary fiction with the aim of interrogating things such as their approach to slavery, invasion, and colonisation. Because the novels that I discuss engage in more modest interjection rather than interpolation, they may not initially be understood as works of historical fiction. Their use of history and memory is often subtle and nuanced, although in the two novels that I discussed, The Kindness of Enemies and The Map of Love, the historical exploration is actually quite overt. Nevertheless, they will engage in Ashcroft's concept of interjection, and they therefore make a significant contribution to both our understanding of historical events and our understanding of the process of remembering and revisiting history. So, I chose a particular text I'm about to talk about because ultimately they're asking how processes of movement and the act of crossing borders affects identity. And these identities are shown to morph and change over the decades and even centuries. Although both novels are of course fictional, they remain consistently relevant, particularly now when thinking about issues such as global migration and Islamophobia. And I think this ties in quite nicely what Matthew was saying about Donald Trump and the Muslim ban, and it speaks to that as well. So the first author I'm going to talk about, Leila Abu Leila, is a Sudanese writer living in Scotland. The second is Adaf Suwaif, an Egyptian author living in London. They're not traditionally considered writers of historical fiction, but Abu Leila's most recent novel, The Kindness of Enemies, and Adaf Suwaif's The Map of Love, are novels that place history and memory at the forefront of their exploration into contemporary Muslim identities. Both Suwaif and Abu Leila's novels focus on an investigative protagonist, Amal Al-Gamwari in The Map of Love, and Natasha Wilson in The Kindness of Enemies. Both women combine historical research with the tracing of heroic anti-colonial ancestors. So Natasha conducts research into the life of Imam Shamil, a Muslim leader in the Murid War of 1813 to 1859 between the Russian Empire and the tribes of the Caucasus Mountains. He is also the supposed ancestor of her friend Malak. This fictional imagining of events is paralleled with a present-day narrative which explores the perpetual suspicions and hostilities aimed at Muslims in Britain by state powers post 9/11. Adaf Suwaif's Amal learns of her great-aunt Anna Winterbourne's travels abroad and her subsequent change from indifferent English aristocrat to anti-colonial Egyptian nationalist. Through this return to ancestral stories, both a reader and the novel's characters find themselves thinking critically about the global position of Muslim citizens today. I argue that Abu Leila and Suwaif employ narratives of genealogical memory in particular for two reasons. Firstly, in order to explore pertinent questions about the relationship between memory and post-colonial identity formation, and secondly, to critique contemporary instances of state violence, surveillance and oppression. Through this paper, I hope to bring light to further questions about how we connect the present to the past, particularly from a post-colonial perspective. The characters in The Map of Love and The Kindness of Enemies are not simply spurred on to research the history of the Russians in the Caucasus or the British in Egypt, respectively, but by an interest in history itself. It is their personal investment in genealogy, or the tracing of family lineage and inheritance, that prompts them on their historical journeys. So in The Kindness of Enemies, a student named Oz, which he uses as short for Osama, evokes Imam Shamil as an anti-colonial jihadist hero. Although lacking evidence of a true genealogical connection, Oz constructs much of his Muslim identity around this myth of Shamil. In The Map of Love, Amal lauds her great-uncle Sharif al-Barudi as a passionate Egyptian nationalist martyr, to such an extent that she has intimate dreams of a romantic, incestuous union on her grandmother's bed. In both texts, a sense of spatial dislocation contributes to the need to find comfort in family continuity and genetic associations. Although Amal only moves from her village of Tawasi to Cairo in an act of country-to-city relocation, other members of her family struggle with greater instances of dislocation and displacement. Her mother, for example, is forced to flee Palestine and move to Egypt during Al-Nakba, or the disaster, 1948, when the State of Israel was created. For Malak, Oz and Natasha, migrating to Britain and grappling with the post-9/11 climate of suspicion towards Muslims causes them to find greater comfort in their religious and genealogical roots than in their present situation. The characters in both novels find this comfort in the face of loneliness and non-belonging by tracing their genealogy and attaching themselves to an identity stemming from a historical figure. So Layla Abu Layla, who, as you probably guessed, is top left, was born in Cairo in 1964 to a Sudanese father and an Egyptian mother. She lived in Abu Dhabi for a while, but she lives in Scotland now. This cross-continental experience is likely to have influenced her creation of a Sudanese-Russian protagonist, Natasha Hussein, who later changes her name to Natasha Wilson. Natasha works as a lecturer in history at the University of Aberdeen, and from childhood to adulthood struggles with her dual identity. As a child, she read her dark skin, inherited from her Sudanese mother, as a disconnecting factor between herself and her white Russian mother, so her Sudanese father and her white Russian mother. Into adulthood, she begins to understand the political danger that her dark skin, accompanied by a Muslim and Arab-sounding surname, can put her in during a time of post-9/11 suspicion. So while Abu Layla structures The Kindness of Enemies around two intersecting narratives, one in 21st century Scotland and Sudan, and the other during the Caucasian War of the early to mid-19th century, these strands are closely connected. Both narratives explore individuals coping with complex hybrid identities due to acculturation through mixed marriages, migration, and even kidnappings. Like Abu Layla's earlier novels, The Kindness of Enemies centres on a female protagonist struggling with her Islamic heritage while living in the largely secular West. The Kindness of Enemies is broad in its scope, exploring political, social, and historical conflict. However, the novel employs a deeply personal approach to the Muslim diasporic experience. Abu Layla's novel uses historical and cultural memory as part of a present-day narrative set in 2010 in order to comment on the role of Muslim migrants living in Britain in the post-imperial age. Natasha teaches a student at the university named Oz, who I mentioned earlier, whose nickname, which stems from Osama, came about in order to blur his Muslim identity and hide his outwardly Arab roots. Oz's cultural and familial memory of his supposed ancestor Shamil is passed down both through conversations between Malak, his mother, and Oz, and through Islamic teachings about Shamil as a Sufi hero. Even in the modern-day chapters, Shamil remains a force of great influence. For Oz, he is inspirational in his unapologetic act of jihad against the Russian imperial forces, and in refusing to let go of his understanding of Islam, and refusing to let his understanding of Islam be defined by imperial powers. For Natasha, her academic research into Shamil's life encourages her not towards jihad, but rather to reconsider her Muslim identity through Sufi practices. However, when Oz searches online for Al-Qaeda material to help him with a university assignment on jihad, he is arrested and held in a police cell for questioning. The Kindness of Enemies weaves historical events into a narrative of its own right. Abulela does this by creating a fictionalised account of the story of the handing over of Shamil's son to the Tsar during the Caucasian War and the subsequent kidnapping of Anna, Princess of Georgia, by Shamil. This narration of cross-cultural experience between the Muslim mountain dweller and the Georgian aristocrat serves as an exercise in historical fiction. However, this narrative also runs alongside the present-day action in order to inform our understanding of events. Through this fictional rendition, Abulela encourages readers to take a critical stance towards the society portrayed in the present-day narrative, particularly the post-9/11 atmosphere of distrust. Cultural close-mindedness within institutions such as universities, the police, and the press is particularly demonstrated through their unwillingness to comprehend the nuances of sincere Muslim faith as distinct from Islamism. This is enacted and ultimately challenged through the historical and contemporary plot lines that run parallel through the novel. Through her literary imagining of historical events, Abulela is able to explore the personal aspects of these cross-cultural experiences. In using these first-person narratives, particularly from the perspective of the Princess Anna, she's able to dramatise the positive and negative aspects of Russian-Muslim relations in the 19th century. On a broader scale, Abulela adopts a critical perspective on the structures of hegemony that existed at the time. In particular, she lambasts the Russian imperialist attitude towards its disempowered territories and the prevailing patriarchal traditions among both Muslim and Russian communities. It is this critical approach towards structures of oppression that connect the historical chapters with the modern ones. These oppressions are explored through British attitudes towards Muslims more generally, and in particular, the attitude of state powers and institutions towards Muslims who they deem as suspicious. Both the historical and the contemporary narratives engage with the idea that individual identity is constantly in flux due to the continuous play, to quote Stuart Hall, history, culture, and power. The historical narrative directly engages with the power dynamics and shifting identities of those who are the subject to the process of aggressive colonial expansion. The contemporary narrative does not present a society under the control of colonial power as such, but rather examines the subtle forms of post-colonial state and societal aggression against those who are presumed to be radical Muslims. Through this back and forth between the modern day and the 19th century, Abulela makes meaningful and critical connections between explicitly imperialist forms of aggression and today's post-9/11 era of suspicion towards Muslim citizens. So the novel that I have put alongside The Kindness of Enemies is Adaf Suwaif's The Map of Love, which is significantly older. I think it was 1999, compared with The Kindness of Enemies, which was only a couple of years ago. But anyway, so The Map of Love is concerned with the process of uncovering history, discovering stories, and tracing genealogy. Because of this, the novel not only functions as a work of historical fiction, but is conscious of the processes and problems of retrospection. The connection between the past and the present is more tenuous in The Kindness of Enemies than it is in The Map of Love. In The Kindness of Enemies, as I explained, Abulela uses real historical events to devise an imaginative narrative that offers a minority perspective on a crucial time in Muslim history. The connection between the past and the present is nebulous. Osman Malak claimed lineage with Imam Shamil through an unconfirmed family myth, and Natasha has a connection only through her research interests. The historical narrative runs parallel to the present-day narrative, but it's only loosely stitched together by these genealogical threads. The thematic connections of state violence and cross-cultural relations are for the characters and the reader to discover themselves as the novel progresses. So Adaf Suwaif was born in Cairo in 1950 and was educated in Egypt and England. As well as being a fiction writer, she's appeared in literary magazines, newspapers, and radio and television shows across the world. She also has a very active Twitter presence, in case anybody's interested in following her, though I think a lot of it is in Arabic. So. The Map of Love, as I said, was published in 1999, and Suwaif has actually not published any substantial works of fiction since then. However, she has produced a significant amount of non-fiction, such as a collection of social and political essays entitled Mesoterra, Fragments from the Common Ground, which I would recommend. Sort of essays of varying lengths on lots of different subjects. And Cairo, My City, Our Revolution. Writing in August 2012, not long after the Egyptian presidential inauguration of Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, Suwaif explains the struggle of producing fiction at the height of the Arab Spring. She says, and this is a quote, "Attempts at fiction right now would be too simple. The immediate truth is too glaring to allow a more subtle truth to take form. For reality has to take time to be processed, to transform into fiction. So it's no use a story presenting itself, tempting, asking to be written, because another story will, in the next minute, come roaring over it, making the same demand." For Suwaif, the desire to produce fiction has become overshadowed by the ongoing political and social turmoil of the Arab Spring. She explains that at this time of crisis, as she calls it, the time and space needed for an author to process events, reflect on their significance, and reproduce them through fiction is just difficult to obtain. So whilst Abu Layla has increasingly found that historical events can illuminate present-day issues, Suwaif has rather gone the other way, struggling with the relationship between politics and fiction. The Map of Love, however, is a deeply political novel, engaging with ideas of colonialism, state violence, history, and cross-cultural encounters. Using a wide range of artefacts and correspondences, such as letters, diary entries, paintings, tapestries, and clothes, the novel's late 20th century protagonist, Amal, delves into the lives of her great-aunt, Anna Winterbourne, and her great-uncle, Sharif, her early 20th century ancestors. Two other central but present-day storylines run alongside this historical exploration into cross-cultural relations. One of these storylines involves Amal struggling with her daily life as a translator living alone in Cairo, her children having grown up and left. Disillusioned with her present and unsure about her future, Amal's genealogical quest causes her to retreat into the past to such an extent that the boundaries between the past and the present begin to blur, both consciously and unconsciously. For example, when uncovering information about a fraudulent letter written by a man called Harry Boyle, who was a British agent and consul general living in Egypt, and he wrote this fraudulent letter claiming that there was Egyptians were going to rise up against the British, and he wrote this to incite anti-Muslim sentiment in Egypt. And Amal discovers this, and she feels desperate to, and this is a quote, rush back to the past and tell Sharif what's happening. Again, while reading an entry in Anna's diary, Amal narrates in a way that merges Anna's perspective with her own. It reads, "As Anna lifts her eyes from the letter, I see Mabruka the maid come into the harem lek." Here, Amal is not only reading about her family history, but has transported her imagination back in time and within this history, blurring the boundaries between past and present, reality and fantasy. The act of border crossing is ultimately the crux of the novel. A particularly resonant moment that highlights Anna Winterbourne, and that's the ancestor of Amal, that highlights Anna Winterbourne's act of shifting from British society into Egyptian. So she, I'll give you a little bit of background on that because it is quite a complex novel. So Anna Winterbourne was living in Britain with her husband, and he came back from the war very traumatised, injured, and their relationship fell apart, and he eventually dies. We don't really know how, but it's sort of hinted it's a combination of trauma and maybe picking up some sort of disease. And after that, she visits one of the museums in London, and she sees all these beautiful paintings of Egypt, and she thinks, you know what, I'm going to go to Egypt, I'm going to discover other cultures, I'm going to expand my mind. So, as I was saying, a particularly resonant moment that highlights Anna Winterbourne's act of shifting from British society into Egyptian is when she sees members of the British agency at a train station on her way to Sinai. Unrecognisable in her veil, which she's wearing at the train station, which becomes symbolic of a divide between herself and her British friends, they pass Anna without acknowledgement. She writes, "I felt at once the fear of being discovered and the strangeness of their sweeping by me without acknowledgement. But the oddest thing of all was that I suddenly saw them as bright exotic creatures, walking in a kind of magical space, oblivious to all around them, at ease, chattering to each other as though they were out for a stroll in the park, while the people, pushed aside, watched and waited for them to pass." Although Anna is not quite expressing active criticism of the British presence in Egypt at this moment, she begins to understand the enormity of their presence. In the scene, she switches places, becoming the watcher rather than the watched, and the reader therefore follows her on a journey from Western aristocrat to Egyptian colonised subject. Although encouraged to visit Egypt by an Orientalist understanding of the country inspired by white male artists such as John Frederick Lewis, Anna becomes critical of British imperialism and begins gradually to speak out against it. By exploring colonial history alongside discussions of the Israel-Palestine conflict in the contemporary chapters, Swaif draws attention to connections between this early 20th century colonialism and present-day conflict. By encouraging a reader to make these associations, Swaif is able to upbraid what she sees as present-day imperialism made palatable by the US, Britain, and Western media outlets. Although no part of the novel is set in Palestine, the Israel-Palestine conflict haunts both the historical and contemporary chapters. As well as becoming more conscious of British injustices against the Egyptians, Anna writes to her friend back home, Sir Charles, and explains her fear that the activities of the Jewish settlers, quote, are bound to cause a rift between the Jews on the one hand and the Christians and Muslims on the other. She further states that the Palestine office is, quote, really a colonial office, organising the purchase of land which from the day of its purchase is never to be allowed to pass into non-Jewish hands. So as you may have gathered, Adaf Sawais is very pro-Palestine, and she talks about a lot of this in her non-fiction as well. So previously ignorant of the growing tensions in Palestine, Anna becomes aware of understandings of Zionism as a colonial enterprise. Although none of the historical chapters are certain of how the situation in Palestine will develop, there is an awareness of an injustice of settlement on Arab land. So I'm just going to kind of round up what I got from comparing these two novels, because unfortunately the chapter is actually a rather gigantic 15,000 words, but we would be here for quite a long time. So I've had to pare this down to about 3,000. So in this literary analysis, I basically explored how Adaf Sawais and Leila Abu Leila adopt narratives of family lineage and historical research in order to interrogate the relationship between imperialist regimes and present-day instances of culture crossing and violence in a globalised world. The Kindness of Enemies I've shown uses a historical narrative to argue for cross-cultural understanding and to expose the problems with contemporary multiculturalism in Britain. Natasha is a successful academic. Her friend Malak works in television, and Malak Sanoz is a top university student. Under the surface, their lives, however, are tainted with suspicion and stereotypes. The connection between the historical chapters and the contemporary ones is not made explicit, but I argue that Abu Leila employs a narrative of the Russian Empire to draw connections between colonial forms of violence and present-day suspicion. Although it also could be argued that you could go beyond Abu Leila's exploration from suspicion and go further towards actual everyday violence, such as unjust imprisonment of Muslims that have been connected with terrorist organisations and things like that. Although she doesn't discuss that too explicitly in the book, but I think that, you know, this is all connected. So the connection between the, and most importantly, she highlights the need for cross-cultural relations, but simultaneously implies that there are limitations to what the individual can achieve when living within regimes that allow inequalities between Russians and their annexed people, and between Britain and its Muslim population. The Map of Love similarly explores cross-cultural relationships through a focus on intimate and familial ties. However, Sawais' novel is less optimistic than Abu Leila's about the potential of cross-cultural relationships. In a powerful act of anti-imperialism, Anna Winterbourne falls in love with and marries Sharif, only for him to be murdered while their marriage is still young. Coming full circle, the end of the novel suggests that Amar's brother Omar has also been murdered. Cross-cultural relationships, she shows, are tainted by politics and therefore violence. On a broader scale, Sawais employs a narrative of British brutality in colonial Egypt to examine the past and the atrocities that colonial powers committed under a guise of a civilising mission. However, she also questions the future, particularly the human rights abuses and mutual violence occurring between Israel and the people of the Palestinian territories. The Map of Love poses questions about the future of cross-cultural encounters that can apply across many contexts. For example, how much of an impact can cross-cultural relationships really have in the face of political turmoil? And what is the future of the global ummah, or the Muslim family, if countries such as Britain and the US continue to support countries such as Israel, whose occupation of Palestine, she claims, is reminiscent of the empires of the 19th century? So to conclude, through narratives that combine both imperial history and present-day politics with genealogical quests, The Kindness of Enemies and The Map of Love highlight the importance of looking back to the past in order to make sense of the present. The kind of border crossings that they describe, colonial excursions and wartime kidnappings, are rather unfamiliar to a reader now. Yet the themes they highlight, migration, violence, family and love, are universal.
I'm delighted to introduce to you David, Professor Lomas has written a number of works relating medical definitions, concepts and representations to visual culture. David has published on Picasso's Le Demoiselle d'Avignon in relation to anthropological and medical theories of degeneration. His work on Frida Kahlo is published in Adler and Poynton's The Body Imaged, published in 1993. His doctoral thesis on surrealism, The Haunted Self, Surrealism, Psychoanalysis and Subjectivity, was published in the year 2000. David Lomas has written and published on many different aspects of surrealism, as well as medical psychology. Other research interests include the surrealist reception in Australian art from the 1930s to the present. I'm aware that his more recent interests encompass non-Western cultures, including Chinese culture and Western visual culture. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your contribution for us today, David, from a posthuman, most likely trans-civilizational perspective, looking at Western and non-Western cases of visual culture from your particular perspective. I'm sure this will greatly benefit our discussion today.
It is it's quite a privilege to be taking part in this seminar, and I'm really honoured to be invited. Amongst the many nice things one could say about Matt, I think not the least important in the present day is that he's a good European. I'm grateful to him for introducing me to the posthuman by inviting me to take part in this event, because I must admit it's a concept that a term and body of writing that has mostly passed me by. I blame that on the fact that I was doing my postgraduate work at the Kershaw Institute, which at the point in time when this particular notion seems to have taken off. And the reason why I've included a question mark in my title, because I think it will be for you to decide whether what I have to speak about today, which is my own work as an artist, has any relation at all to your understanding of the posthuman. I've used the term delineating in the sense of drawing a line around something, because it is my artwork that I'm going to be talking about, and these two terms, contagion and connectivity, I think sort of reference the two clusters of work that I suspect may have a connection with the posthuman. They also happen to be two of the dominant metaphors for thinking about experience in a networked, internet dependent society of the kind that we live in. I think my topic sort of ticks off quite a few of the boxes signposted for the seminar, but I'm less sure actually about the transcultural aspect. I've long believed, in fact, for all of my adult life really, in the value of culture in terms of a kind of anti-hegemonic force, shall we say, within the world. And that's why I think it's really important that institutes like this are supported and that sort of avenues for cultural exchange are kept open. I think actually it will emerge in some of the work at least. Well, no, I think it's a fairly consistent thread, a kind of impulse to inscribe cultural difference and otherness into the work that I make, even if, as I say, it's not a central topic in what I'm going to be talking about today. I used this invitation as an opportunity to look, well, for the first time really, at the exhibition and catalogue titled Posthuman, that was put together by Jeffrey Deitch in 1992. It travelled, it was shown at various different museums, continuing into 93. It's not at all an academic text. I think it conforms, it sort of more resembles, I'd say, a avant-garde manifesto. But there's no doubt that Jeffrey Deitch had his, was aware of, a lot that was in the air, shall we say, at that point in time. And its usefulness for me is, in part, the fact that it's concerned with art. What I've shown there is a kind of collage of some of the artists who are included in that show. Deitch says that it's trying to showcase a turn towards figurative art, but not in the traditional media of painting or sculpture. Rather, he sees the most innovative work at this point in time, 1992, as being in other media, photography. I've included a photograph by Cindy Sherman, their installational work, Robert Gober, and not so much sort of sculpture as I suppose as assemblage in the form of this oversized mannequin by Charles Ray. Now, a number of these the artists that were shown in this exhibition have become kind of emblematic of those decades of the 1980s and 1990s. How my work differs is, I guess I'm, sharing in common this interest in the figure and the body, and correlated with that, according to Jeffrey Deitch, new subjectivities that he sees expressed through the work. But I would say that my interest is primarily in painting, and more broadly in the image, since we live now, I think, in a culture where images have a kind of ubiquity that they've never had previously. In 1992, I think sort of painting really was in eclipse. Everyone was talking about the death of painting, but there's been a kind of resurgence since then. And I like to think myself that there's a kind of resistant value in an anachronistic medium like painting, especially, as I say, in relation to the wider image world that we inhabit. Now, just to move to the first of my topics, contagion, I wanted to cheat a little bit by reading out a couple of paragraphs for an abstract for a conference that I and also Matt and a PhD student who was Neil MacDonald, who was working on me at the time. This was in I think about 2013 or even maybe before that, had planned. Perhaps we should come back to this someday, but I think it'll sort of put you into the picture as to my take on the notion of contagion. I'll just read this couple of, well, I won't read the two paragraphs in their entirety, but just excerpt some relevant points. The elaboration of a concept of sacred contagion by Emil Durkheim in 1912, whereby the spiritual properties of an object, place, or person can be transferred to another by means of contact or physical proximity, is one notable example of how an idea of contagion has found resonance in the explanation of cultural and social phenomena. Durkheim was writing in the wake of Pasteur's discoveries about microbial disease, when the idea of contagion itself is highly infectious. In our own day, as the number and variety of biological agents producing contagion has expanded, retroviruses, prions, and so forth, so too it seems that contagion and contagion theory has gone viral in academic discourse as well as in popular culture. Memes, which are predicated on an idea of viral replication, have been proposed as the cultural unit of contagion. Anthropologist Dan Sperber's, quote, epidemiology of representations implies that cultural evolution obeys epidemiological laws. We witnessed the contagious spread of revolution among social media savvy crowds in the Arab Spring, and financial contagion, this was back in 2013, currently threatens the Eurozone. The AIDS epidemic wreaked havoc in the 1980s and 90s, revivifying a pathologizing association between contagion and queer sexuality. Queer theory and our practice have been deeply marked by this relatively recent experience of contagion, a major factor in the resurgence of abjection in art in recent decades. While one might have thought that disease is solely destructive of communities, the example of AIDS has shown how the opposite can also be the case. I just sort of recently became aware that one of Incel, one of the Google, the applications that the free downloads that Google provides for its cardboard virtual reality headset is premised on the idea of a race or a chase between a miniaturized subject who sort of enters into this cell and a viral invasion, in this case nothing worse than influenza. And at one point the voiceover states, "Virus detected, buckle up human, we're going in." And I think it just sort of illustrates the hold that the notion of viruses still have over our imagination. I've interspersed sort of various quotes from Dietsch's catalogue essay, referring, this is in the early 90s, to this surge, he says, of seemingly untamable viruses, biological, social, environmental, and he mentions computer viruses. In the works that I've sort of made on the subject of contagion, I was inclined to see sort of contagion as a kind of cosmic principle. I'd been reading Lucretius's atomistic theories, and the idea that the university is composed of tiny particles, including things which sort of sound to our ears, sort of rather like a description of microbes. And so that encouraged me to think about contagion, as I say, as a kind of cosmic principle, but also as something positive. And I think in these works, to some extent, I was trying to work against or work through the traumatic effects of HIV/AIDS in those decades of the 1980s and 90s, and that at that point in time, I think one didn't have to be infected with the virus in order to be living with AIDS, as the expression went. I think its imaginative hold and sort of impact across the culture was very visceral. This picture at the left there, Contagion Landscape, is sort of one example of these works, and what I was trying to do there, as I say, was to treat sort of contagion as a positive force. The landscape itself is something that I've appropriated from Stubbs, George Stubbs. So it's a landscape that sort of is British, speaks to Britishness in its essence. The oak tree on the right, that sort of features in a lot of Stubbs' work, and a kind of, symbolises a sort of genealogy, bloodlines and so forth. A lot of Stubbs's pictures were of horses, as I'm sure you would know. So what I decided to do was to let loose these Assyrian huntsmen in this paradigmatically sort of British landscape. The sleeping, possibly dead figure on the right-hand side is Endymion, a sculpture by Canova. I think it's one of the most, to my mind, the most beautiful sculpture in Britain. It's in Chatsworth House, and I was using, I referred before to this idea of the death of painting, and I think sort of painting that's sort of made after conceptual art and the kind of work that we saw before has to acknowledge its belatedness, its death, if you like. And so for me, Endymion, this sleeping figure who might be dead but might awaken, was a kind of stand-in, if you like, for the artist after the end of art. And I guess the whole sort of scenario could be understood at some level as Endymion's dream world. Endymion was, of course, a hunter. One of the sort of key claims in the catalogue, Posthuman, but perhaps in Posthuman itself, is that we're dealing with fundamentally new formations of subjectivity in the present, which sort of justify this term, the posthuman. What I think is perhaps an open question is the extent to which those changes in subjectivity were a consequence of the experience of AIDS in the 1980s, continuing into the 1990s as well, or of the other factors that Jeffrey Deitch and other writers on the posthuman adduce, biological and technologies, things that have impinged on the body, as well as new communication technologies. And it might depend in part on which particular group one's talking about, how important these things were. But Derrida, in this particular quote, I think sort of intimates that the radical consequences of the experience of AIDS for a philosophical conception of the subject. He mentions, the way that in the wake of Freud we've tended to understand the subject in terms of an ego and an unconscious and so on and so forth. And I think for me one of the more interesting claims by Deitch in his catalogue, the Posthuman, is that we're witnessing, he suggests at that point in time, the dissolution of the Freudian psychological model of the depth model of the psyche. Now, when I first started making images, and I was working sort of initially with Photoshop, partly because I didn't have time to paint. This was, I've only started making images again in the past 3 or 4 years. My initial impulse was to scan drawings and paintings that I'd made many years ago. In this case, a pen and ink drawing of a tree in a park in Brisbane, in Australia, where I lived until 1985, when I came to the UK, as a kind of exile, I would say, escaping a situation that was paranoid, yes. And these works, kind of, part of their purpose, I think, is to do with memory. It's about sort of reconnecting with the past, with sort of threads that have been left hanging. But what I initially I started using Photoshop as a kind of collage technique, but what I quickly realized is that the medium specificity of Photoshop, if you like, is to do with layering. These kinds of images are perhaps, somewhere between collage and a sort of layered palimpsest, using the sort of blending functions of photocollage, of Photoshop, sorry. There's a kind of transparency, so there's a sort of flatness and depth, but that's, as I say, is somewhere between a collage, which one thinks of as typically sort of flat, as sort of emphasizing the flatness of the paper or of the whatever support is being used, and a kind of sort of layered depth. And perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, there's a kind of formal analogy to be drawn there between this sort of transparency, the kind of absence of depth, and these the suggestions that a sort of Freudian depth model of the psyche, something which had perhaps sort of prevailed up until fairly recently, was becoming obsolete. I've also been sort of quite impressed myself by accounts of the experience of AIDS, which talk about a kind of permeability of the body and its orifices and membranes and so forth, and the implications of that for thinking about subjectivity. So I won't say, I couldn't say more than that. It sort of relates in a rather sort of indirect way to a picture by Caravaggio called Boy Bitten by a Lizard, but I need too long on a couch to really be able to explain. 2 minutes. Oh, okay. Well, I'll press on in that case. The second group of works I wanted to speak about sort of came about because I was thinking about the problem of the eroticized body in painting, something which had been subjected to critique by feminism on account of the objectification of the female body, in particular in Western art. And I was thinking about sort of ways that it might be possible to sort of reintroduce the body. And I've been looking. This is sort of really quite recent work at dating apps as the site for of a novel iconography of the body. What we're sort of talking about here are naked selfies, basically. And as I say, I see this these platforms as a site where new ways of thinking about the body and perhaps also new subjectivities are being sort of experimented with. One of the few academic studies of this phenomenon so far has looked at these images as part of a kind of gift economy, as images that are exchanged, I guess, in but I think beyond that, they can also be seen as experimenting with identities, as I'll hope to suggest just sort of very briefly. These are a couple of small etchings that I've made, and I think you can sort of, recognize some of the iconological tropes. The body tends to be quite cropped, very foreshortened. Generally, there's an arm reaching out of the picture, sort of holding a camera. And, one of the striking features of this sort of, proliferation of imagery online is its, apparent blurring of, sort of boundaries between public and private, such as they'd existed previously. And, as I was saying earlier, for Deitch and other writers on the posthuman, the emergence of new identities, new subjectivities is held as a crucial piece of evidence in favour of this term. And certainly, I think for a lot of users of these sites, the purpose of is not one of hooking up, as it were, for sex, but rather as a platform in which to experiment with identities through images. And the work on the left is by a young artist, Oliver Crabtree, working in Manchester, who's been working, playing around, I think, with the kinds of semiotics of bodily semiotics involving hair in particular, and different stereotypes. The three stereotypes that he's interested in are of the, if I get this right, the twink, the jock, and the bear, with, as I say, hair, for instance, being a key differentiating factor between these. Anyway, the image on the right is an example of the kinds of works that I've been making in response to this imagery. One of the things that strikes me, in which sort of apparently contradicts the claim that this work is about connecting with others, is the predominantly sort of autoerotic sort of character of the imagery, and I'm sort of intrigued by the emergence of a new narcissistic sort of subject in the present. Okay, sort of going right on. Unfortunately, I won't be able to talk about this at any length, but I've dubbed these works neurorealism on the premise that the real sort of that reality ultimately sort of exists within the brain, in the connections between neurons that underlie the activity of the brain, its processing of information, our capacity to think. And so in these works I've used that sort of neural network as a kind of grid or matrix in which to embed other sorts of imagery, in this case the body, which is in the process of becoming insubstantial as it's sort of absorbed into this image world that I was talking about. I've surrounded the body with gadgets, things like sort of laptops, as you see here, and so forth. So exploring this metaphor of connectivity, both at a level within the brain, but also within the society of a sort of networked society, as well as the kind of neural networks that sort of underpin thought. I haven't got time really to go into these are paintings that were based on screenshots from a video that someone had uploaded. Well, actually, they're studies for paintings, and I kind of put wanted to put the image, which, as you can see, is sort of ostensibly sort of autoerotic in character, but is to put that in dialogue with a philosophical discourse about desire, which I've taken from Alexandra Kershaw's reading of Hegel's phenomenology, and I'm interested in the, just sort of briefly, in the degradation of the digital image on one hand. I mean that in sort of multiple senses, but also in, and I wanted to sort of convey the impression in the picture that sort of painting is coming after the digital image, but also to create an impression of beauty in spite of all of that. There's a fair bit going on there, more than I can really talk about. I'm thinking of one of the directions I'd like to pursue this interest further is to look at virtual reality. I'm sort of intrigued that someone can be, or at least their brain can believe them to be occupying a space other than the one that they appear to be in. On the right-hand side there, we've got a screenshot from another one of these Google downloads. It's called In Mind, and the premise is an exploration into the neuronal structure of the mind, and it's a rather powerful experience of virtual reality. It sort of reminded me of the works that I've been making of the type that I've shown already. So what I'm envisaging there is a kind of conflating the two, and just Matt will be pleased that I've arrived at my last slide. I think that in a way we're all suffering from too much connectivity, and one of the sort of latest sort of impulses in my work, sort of which is inspired in part by looking at the artists, scholars of ancient China, and this idea of the artistic recluse, is to sort of visit in fantasy, as it were, sort of various sites in Australia that I've never actually been to, but to sort of do so in the guise of a Chinese scholar artist. And I think sort of that's perhaps sort of another example of where I've specifically tried to sort of incorporate cultural difference into the work. So that's for this question of connectivity. I was sort of interested to discover while I was sort of preparing this talk a thread on a blog called The Student Room, where a new PhD student asks, whatever happened to shy, reclusive academics? And I'm sure with a slightly satiric pen writes that what they, the students' new colleagues, are most brilliant at is this thing called networking. What's more, they do so with such ease. They're great at schmoozing and small talk, floating from one conversation to another and making connections. That may be something that you will recognise from your own experience. I certainly do, and I'd say that the promotional, sort of self-promotional profiles that university academics such as myself are now compelled to put online, I find more obscene and pornographic than anything I've seen in Grindr or Squirt or Scruff or these apps in the course of this project. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening anyway.